This is funny. Actually, this is the funny thing about the age that we live in is I'm ostensibly talking to 2 to 4 people, but I'm also potentially talking to my great grandchildren, or who knows, online. And I do wonder, one of the interesting things about growing up as a grandson of Marshall McLuhan, for example, in the age that we live in, is he was so present over different types of media, print media, visual, audio, that he may be gone, but he has such a presence, like a contemporary presence on YouTube and whatever else. So it's a very strange thing. It's a privilege to be able to get to know somebody after they've died because they're so present. It's not just some family photos or maybe a recorded wedding speech or something. It's like there's hundreds of hours of content out there in just audio and video, never mind all the articles and interviews and whatever else. So that's an odd thing, and I'm very aware of that whenever I talk, which is also a weird thing because you try to be present in the moment, but at the same time, you have to be conscious that it could very well, you might be looking at yourself in 10 years, looking back on this or whatever. But that's also, you have to assume that anything you do today is recorded one way or another. Even taking my dog for a walk up the lane, there's a possibility I'm on somebody's trail cam, right? Or that satellites are watching you or monitoring you or whatever. It's a very strange place to be. But my talk today, Liz put down as discussing the McLuhan Institute current work and future plans. And then she quoted me where someplace I said the McLuhan Institute will be a world-class research institute, archive, museum, center for learning and exploration, refuge and incubator for all kinds of arts, which is maybe a little bit grandiose. But, I'm the kind of person that I believe in shooting for the stars, and if you end up on the moon, that's still pretty impressive, So you can always bargain down, right? But it's hard to bargain up. So always set your sights, I think, higher even than you think are possible, and you'll get somewhere good, and you might even get farther than you thought, right? But the reason there's a McLuhan Institute in the first place, so I'll give a little bit of context for those who don't know who Marshall McLuhan was and what he was up to. And it's interesting because if you ask different people, they'll tell you different things because everybody has a perspective. I have a particular perspective being in a sort of lineage. For me, Marshall McLuhan was my grandfather, right? He was a person, not just McLuhan or a thinker or a media pioneer or things like this. He was a person, I was only 2.5 years old when he died, but how I actually knew him was when I was just over a year old, he had a stroke, which rendered him unable to communicate. He couldn't read, he couldn't talk. He could whistle or sing sometimes. Occasionally he would be able to say something that made any sense, but really all he could do was babble. Apparently he would say like, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, or things like that. And the funny thing is I was just starting to speak, and apparently we would have like these nonsense conversations, which I have no memory of obviously, but I like to imagine it sounded like nonsense to anybody else, but to us it was obviously, important things we were discussing. But I've had to get to know him like anybody else through his work and through the things that he's left behind. And his work, he's considered, and not just by me, one of the pioneers of a particular type of media studies, studying the effect of innovation and technology on humans and culture. And what he did that was different, I always remind people that he was actually an English teacher for his entire career. He started in English literature, and he actually was quite well known as a literary critic and educator before he got known for his side hustle, which was media studies. And basically, what he did that was different was he took what he had learned for approaching literature and turned those tools of literary criticism onto technology and culture, which was a new thing. And is basically the basis of what he did. The other thing that he did was he took an interdisciplinary approach. So with a colleague of his at the University of Toronto, Edmund Carpenter, Ted Carpenter was an anthropologist, and he and Marshall put a team together made up of anthropologists, people in literature, history, economics, psychology. They built an interdisciplinary group, and this was unusual at the time because universities were, and they still very much are, very conservative institutions with very siloed knowledge. You know, it's an environment of specialists, really. And although it's wider, it's more open now, but back in the day, you were expected to be in your specialty and to stay in it. So some English teacher was not really welcome to be, pulling from all these different fields. It's like you should stay in literature or go into communications, but stay in your field, right? But Marshall said, understanding is not a point of view. That, a point of view can only ever be one side of something. So in order to get any kind of complete understanding, you need to attack it from as many sides as possible. And so he brought in not only English literature, but also economics and history and psychology, because he felt that technologies affect us on more than just the level of utility or use. That, content, he paraphrased T.S. Eliot when he said that content is the juicy piece of meat used by the burglar to distract the watchdog of the mind. And what he meant by that was that, while we're busy reading the words on the page or watching something on the television or online, the actual technology itself is readjusting our senses and our sensory makeup. Because one thing he learned was that technologies affect us on a sensorial level. And when you affect one sense, you affect all our senses, because all of our senses, sight, touch, hearing, taste, proprioception, we have dozens of senses, and they all work in a sort of balance or harmony. And when you affect one, you affect them all. There's a guy, Jacques Luciran, who wrote a book called And There Was Light. And in this book, he talks about how at a young age, around age 6 or so, he went blind over a matter of days. And Marshall loved this book because it describes in vivid detail how, as his visual faculty dimmed, his other faculties perked up. His sense of touch, his sense of sound, all these things heightened and created a new balance. And this is a commonplace thing to hear about. People who are blind, have more acute hearing or sensitive touch or things like this. But it illustrated his point that, when you affect one sense, you affect all the senses. And if you think about it, your experience of life as a blind person is drastically different from your experience of life as a sighted person, right? Not only your experience of day-to-day life, but also your perception of who you are, your self-identity, and also other people's perception of your identity. Perception and your actual physical makeup, they're two different things, but they're related. So these things drastically change who we are individually, and when you change everybody individually, you get societal effects too. So Marshall's work focused on what he called the personal and social consequences of technologies, how technologies, innovations change who we are personally, like individually, and then by extension societally. And that the lion's share of changes come from changing society and that whole environment. And this happens whether, we're using Zoom to get together and have a birthday party, or whether we're using it to get together and do a think tank thing. The fact is that it's the aggregate effect of millions, billions maybe, of people using Zoom more over the past 2 years that have reshaped what human association means in the last 2 years. Not so much by the individual use, but by the cumulative effect of it all. So this was kind of Marshall's unique contribution to the field, which up to his point, communications study was more about the Shannon-Weaver model of communication, which is like a more strictly measurable scientific approach where you have like a signal and you're sending it somehow and something happens along the way, some noise, and it's received by somebody. But Marshall looked beyond that into the more dramatic personal and social changes that happen as an effect. So most of this work happened while he was at the University of Toronto from 1946 on. And while he was there in the mid-60s, he was allowed to open something called the Center for Culture and Technology. And this was it's a very modest building. It's not much bigger than, actually, the main room is the size of this room. It was 2-story. It was a converted coach house, kind of behind some other buildings on campus at St. Michael's College. And the interesting thing is, like by the mid-60s, Understanding Media came out, and for the next few years, Marshall's star ascended, which is kind of a whole other story. But Marshall started to get a lot of offers to teach and go to other places, but he was happy to stay in Toronto because he was really left alone. His work has always been better received outside of Canada than within it, and that kind of sucks on one hand, but on another hand, it means that you're left alone a bit more. He knew that if he accepted offers to teach somewhere like Princeton or Harvard or whatever, he wouldn't have time to get the work done. And that's what he was interested in doing. And as it turned out, people came to him in Toronto, and it made it a bit of a destination, which was interesting. Fast forward, so Marshall had this stroke in '78. He ended up dying at the age of 69 on New Year's Eve 1980, before his 70th birthday, which he was expected to recover from the stroke, and eventually they were trying to teach him to speak again and everything, and he was expected to live, but he died kind of suddenly. My dad, Eric, had started working with him in the mid-late 60s as his personal assistant, and my father was also an academic, a really deep academic, and he became his father's closest collaborator, working together on a lot of important work, kind of behind the scenes, I guess. Like his name isn't featured on a lot of the things that he worked with Marshall, but he didn't really care about that kind of thing. But the point is, when Marshall died, New Year's Eve 1980, nobody was expecting it, and there wasn't any plan, really, to keep going. My dad had worked with Marshall very informally, and he was kind of left without a plan of any sort. He didn't work for the University of Toronto. They closed the Center for Culture and Technology shortly after Marshall had his stroke, and it wouldn't reopen for some time later. So my dad ended up kind of working on his own in isolation, really, which he was happy about. He actually didn't enjoy public speaking very much. He just wanted to study and do the work on his own. And he spent his career tying up a lot of loose ends, things that Marshall had started, Marshall and my father had started. He put out, a dozen or so books, some very important work. And my parents moved here to the county in the late 90s, and they ended up settling near Bloomfield here. And my dad converted their 2-story, it was either a pig or a sheep barn, to be his office and archive. And I only kind of a couple of years ago realized that the actual footprint of his office here is very similar to that for the Center for Culture and Technology in Toronto, which was a coach house, and this was also a small barn. And why that's significant to me is when I thought about starting the McLuhan Institute, I kind of had my eyes on a piece of land in Picton. And I was like, okay, I'll get this piece of land and I'll build this world-class research institute and whatever else. And then I realized that we already have this property here, and it's basically the same footprint or size as Marshall's Center for Culture and Technology. And really, if that was enough for Marshall to do his thing, then this has got to be enough for me, right? And again, when I thought about starting up the McLuhan Institute, some people said to me, well, you'll need to be in Toronto or New York or things like that. And I just realized that, no, this is the perfect place to be because, well, for one thing, most of Marshall McLuhan's, his papers and things are at the National Archives in Ottawa. And then his library, his personal books that he annotated and worked with are at the University of Toronto. And then here we are kind of right in the middle, and it forms a logical intersection between the two things. And here I am at the McLuhan Institute trying to be a bridge between the past and the present and the future. So it makes a logical amount of sense. Plus, this work is really heavy lifting on the brain. And it's really wonderful to be able to work away in the library or archive for a few hours. And then when it gets to be too much, take a walk up the lane through some fields, with the dog or whatever, and allow your thoughts some room to breathe, beneficial distractions. Because there's the distraction of staring at your phone and scrolling for an hour, which is one thing. You come out of it not much further ahead. And then there's the distraction of sitting and looking at nature and looking at the clouds go by, and you feel invigorated. It's much, much different thing. So for those reasons, I feel this is perfect. Now, I started the McLuhan Institute, around in 2017. I'd been working with my dad. I started doing work with my dad in like 2009, 10. Because when I was younger, it didn't do much for me. As a kid, it didn't make any sense at all. I tried to read Understated Media as a teenager, and it just went over my head. And I tried again in my 20s, and didn't get much further. But I found in my 30s, my dad needed somebody to travel with him, giving talks. And I found that these things made a little bit of sense for the first time. And a little understanding goes a long way and can be a seductive, if not addictive thing. It makes you want to learn more and understand more. And I don't know, I guess I'd grown up, and sometimes, your brain matures, your thoughts mature. I guess I was just at a point where I was ready for this kind of thing, so I started to get more and more and more involved. In 2016, 2017, I kind of looked around. My dad wasn't in the greatest, he wasn't in bad health, but he was a diabetic, and it didn't always go well. And my grandfather had died at age 69. My dad was mid-70s. I started to get nervous because I'm like, oh shoot, he's going to die someday, maybe sooner than later. And what do I do when that happens? I didn't want to be caught without a plan. So I came up with this idea for the McLuhan Institute. The thing is, the Center for Technology reopened in the 80s, and it still exists now under the Faculty of Information at U of T, not St. Michael's College. But it doesn't do the work that Marshall used to do. Different universities, colleges teach courses on McLuhan or McLuhan work, but it's bits and pieces. There's no otherwise dedicated place to continue this work. There's just my dad, who's been working on his own as he sees fit. And I felt that this was something that needed to be maintained and preserved, that it constituted a tradition, an intellectual tradition. And when my dad passed, it would pass with him. Nobody else was going to do anything. My sisters, I love my sisters, they weren't really interested, and they live in the States now. I was kind of there, and I found myself getting more and more interested. And I figured if I didn't do it, nobody would, and that it was worth doing, right? Of course, having an idea and making something of it are different things. So the challenge is always, that's great, but how do you do that? How do you make it sustainable, right? So I came up with this idea for the McLuhan Institute, which would, to put it as simply as possible, continue McLuhan studies in the McLuhan tradition. Of course, what that actually means is another thing. Now, I'm not an academic. I barely graduated high school. I'm a poet. I'm a punk rocker. I ran an upholstery company on my own for 10 years. Like, I work with my hands and I'm interested in practical things, not so much in theory. And I think that we're at a time in our society where, we need more than theory. We need practical things. So my interest with the McLuhan Institute is not so much to create a monument or historical things, although I have historical things to preserve. But my focus, I decided, would be on what's useful from what Marshall and my father did in order to help us going forward. Because the thing was, Marshall, may have been a genius, but he wasn't a wizard. He had methods. He developed ways of looking at technology in order to understand them. And so I decided that the best thing that I could do would be to kind of identify and extract these tools, because a lot of the reason why his work endures is because it's not situated on television or the printed word. It's situated on media, on technology and innovation. And so as long as we continue to innovate and come up with new technologies, we need ways of looking at them. And a lot of what Marshall did was not specific to any one technology, but he looked at technology as a field and developed methods for analyzing and understanding them. And the logical progression there is to move from studying what happened to anticipating what might happen and have that inform what we actually do. Because we're at a point, I think, in history where if we don't start doing that, things don't look so good, right? So, I identified 4 key areas for the McLuhan Institute, and that is research, education, archive, and I probably should have written that down. It's been a while since I've done this spiel. Anyway, again, my focus is on the practical things. So as far as archive goes, so I came up with the idea for the McLuhan Institute summer of 2017. Spring of 2018, my dad died suddenly while we were in Colombia together. So less than a year before, I decided to start the McLuhan Institute, anticipating a day he wouldn't be around, and that happened way sooner than I was expecting. But at least I'd already started to think that way. So my dad left behind a library and archive. Basically, most of what didn't end up in Ottawa or Toronto is here in the county, in my dad's office. And that's everything from his library of around 6,000 books, like more books than are actually here, as well as, various fun artifacts and things that constitute a collection that one day maybe I'll display in an open type setting. For the moment, it's not really publicly accessible, but if you're in the area and want to check it out, hit me up. My dream is definitely to open it up to the public, because this area we live in, Prince Edward County, is very much up and coming still. I mean, it hasn't been a backwater for a long time. It's been a destination for a century or more, really. People have been drawn here. But in the most recent growth with the wine industry and the food industry and spirits and whatever else, there are a lot of recreational reasons for people to visit Prince Edward County. What I'm hoping to do with the McLuhan Institute is provide more educational or intellectual reasons to visit Prince Edward County. So, come for a weekend, fill your head with some ideas, go sample some wine, hit the beach. I think these things could go together really well. So this is my idea, basically, is to set up this research facility. So part of what I do is maintain the artifacts that I have, the working library, ongoing research into developing tools for understanding. The way I bring those forward are through talks like this. I give workshops, I teach classes. I developed a class on understanding media, Marshall's 1964 book. That's basically, it's 36 3-hour classes, which currently take 18 months, but I'm trying to compress that into a school year. I'm trying to wrap up the current one, which is almost halfway through, by the summer, so that I can start in September, the next cohort, and wind it up before summer 2023. In a perfect world, that's how it will go. And the great thing about the age that we live in and the place that we live in is I can teach this class on understanding media and not have to worry about people coming to me in person, because not one person in the county has ever taken my class, which is fine. But luckily we have a good enough internet connection that I think I have around 20 students right now. They're spread out from Europe and a couple in England to mainly North America, Ottawa, Edmonton, Los Angeles, New York, points in between, Brazil. The great thing about our time is that we can do these kinds of things remotely. And there's give and take. I mean, Zoom is a great thing for a lot of reasons. It also has its limitations. Even though there are only 4 people here, that's 4 more people than you can feel when you're giving a talk on Zoom. Because I might be able to see all these people, and I can identify if their camera's on, whether they're awake or asleep, and maybe see that they're somewhat engaged. But you get very little feedback from a screen. You get it's a whole different experience when you're giving a talk in person. You can read a room. You can't read a Zoom, as I say. There's biofeedback that really counts for a lot. And at the end of an hour talk in person, I come away energized, and maybe there's some questions or whatever. After my 3-hour class, or doing a similar presentation just online, I shut the computer and it's like a deep breath, and it's like I need a nap, because it just takes from you, it drains you, it doesn't give much back. So I think that's a fairly pedestrian observation. Everybody feels the same way, but we need to find ways to bring the best of both of our worlds. And I don't know if we can bake into the technology more things that give you similar things to biofeedback or not. It's not generally something that we think of when we design technologies. We usually have a very narrow set of things that we're optimizing for. Generally, it's commerce or attention or whatever else, and not a lot comes from those things. Anyway, my purpose with the McLuhan Institute is to create a place that people can discover online as well as in person. It's important for me to do both, and that's because not everybody can come here. My preference, and I think the reward ratio is much higher when you interact in person. But, not everybody can come to the county. People live all over the world. And so it's important for me to make accessibility is something I'm really concerned with. And accessibility in 2 senses of the word. In just people being able to access things. So having basically an open door policy. But what's the point in being able to access something if you can't make any sense of it? There's an intellectual accessibility that I think is important. And this is why I think that I'm in an interesting position to be taking this work forward. And that's just because I used to think not going to university was a liability, but now I realize it's more of an asset, because it means that I don't speak like somebody who's been to university. I don't try and put that on. I relate to things more poetically and humanistically, person to person. And I honestly think that if I can understand this stuff, then anybody can. Not that it's simple, but if you do a little bit of work, you can figure it out. Another thing that gives me hope is that I teach classes for grade 5 and 6 students, and I teach classes for university students and corporations and whatever. And to me, it's a testament of accessibility if I can explain or help. I don't think in terms of explaining, I think more in terms of helping people understand or learn on their own these concepts. If kids can get it, then the rest of us can. That's a really powerful thing. So research and education archive exploration is the last point for the McLuhan Institute. And that is a big part of what I want to do is arts-based. Marshall McLuhan relied heavily on the arts in his career and to understand technology, because he cribbed this from Ezra Pound, who said that the artist is the antenna of the race. Ezra Pound in ABC of Reading in like 1932 or whatever. And what they meant is that artists are people in society who are constantly sharpening their perceptive faculties. For the rest of us, children and artists are always the sharpest among us. The rest of us, our senses dull over time. Things don't taste as sweet or as sharp as they used to. All of our senses, our eyesight starts to go. We all wear reading glasses. All of our senses start to dull and atrophy from underuse and just getting old. But artists are constantly out there trying to experience things in new ways and trying to relate them to us in new ways. And because of this, they get a sense of technological change before the rest of us. This isn't to say that they understand it any better than the rest of us, but they sense it better than the rest of us. And because of this, they're very useful. It's a bit of a truism that new art always offends the sensibility of the older people. Like, I think about somebody as innocuous to us as Elvis, right? It's hard to imagine a more harmless person than Elvis Presley. But in his time, he created an uproar. He was the ruin of culture. He was bad for kids. Parents didn't want their kids to go to an Elvis show or listen to Elvis, that guy, right? But for us, it's like harmless, right? So the new art always upsets our sensibilities, and that's because it's harnessing the sensibility that's newer than we can perceive. It's mixing with our sensibility, our sense ratios, and there's a dissonance there. Over time, all our senses are going to rearrange, and so it feels tame comparatively. But because of that, the arts are an important place for media studies. And part of my aim with the McLuhan Institute is to foster artistic investigation and exploration of technology. It's our job to draw conclusions from what they come up with. I think it's also our job, and Canada is a great place for it, to facilitate artists of all kinds in their work, because they're one of our best chances to understand what's happening right now, and will soon be a fact of life for the rest of us. So one thing I want to do with the McLuhan Institute, again, in my perfect world down the road, is have permanent artist residency that will rotate every month or two, and be open to anybody artistically exploring the effects of technologies. And that's purposely a very broad category. It doesn't need to be somebody who, has a big record as an artist or established whatever. In fact, the more amateur, the better in a certain sense. The key criteria is exploration. So I want it to be open, and then have a yearly show. One of my pet projects, I do a lot of work with the medium is the message, as you might imagine. It's kind of a low-hanging fruit as far as McLuhan is concerned. And it's actually a very useful one because it's basically McLuhan 101. If you understand the gist of the medium is the message, then you understand just what we're talking about, how it's less the content than the aggregate effect, the changes, which are the message of technologies more than what we use them to do. What I want to do is an artistic exploration of what that means. So every year I want to invite artists of various media, musicians, visual artists, artists of all kinds, to enter a work that demonstrates what the medium is the message means today. In other words, what is our sensorial makeup? What is the effect of technology today? And don't explain it to me, but show it to me. Demonstrate it through music, demonstrate it through a visual work, but show me. And then every year to have an online in-person exhibition. And the great thing about this is that you document this, and then year by year by year, you have a historical artistic record of what the impact of technology is every year and how that shifts and changes. So I've been doing a lot of work identifying where the medium as a message came from. I discovered that Marshall McLuhan first said it in May 1958 at a conference at UBC. It was a radio broadcasters conference, and they were really upset and concerned about television. And Marshall told them that they didn't need to be worried that TV was going to kill radio. TV is going to displace radio. Radio is going to take on a different meaning, but it's not going to die. In fact, it's probably going to be reborn in a whole different sense, but it's going to be here for years to come. And Prince Edward County is a great example of that because we have a new radio station. Radio is very much alive. It's just displaced, and that is the nature of technology. We come up with a new method of doing something that displaces the older method. And the older method doesn't die, it just takes on a new role. And that's what obsolescence really means. Anyway, so he first said it in May 1958, and I've been creating a year-by-year record of different ways that he said the medium is the message, in speech or in print. And I'm building a timeline to hopefully put on a website eventually, one of many things that he grants for. So the idea is to build a visual timeline, 1958 to 1978, 30 years of Marshall McLuhan saying the medium is the message. And then with this art endeavor, to take it forward and start building that timeline so that we create this interesting artistic record of technological change. So that's essentially my vision for the McLuhan Institute. 2 years ago, my wife and I sold our house in Picton, and we bought my parents' property near here in Bloomfield, which is quite ahead of schedule of where I wanted to be with the McLuhan Institute. We have the 2-story barn, which is attached to a 3-story barn. So again, if you think about the Center for Culture and Technology, which was in a 2-story coach house, we have like 3 times the amount of potential space to use. So what I would like to do eventually is develop that property to be a destination where people can come. We can do this talk there instead of here. We can host art exhibits. We can do weekend workshops and retreats. We can have space for the exploration, artistic exploration, for shows and other events that relate to exploring and understanding culture and technology here in Prince Edward County. What else did I want to touch that she mentioned? I think that's most of the points that I wanted to cover. Really, again, my focus is not on building monuments, not on theories, but on tools that we can use today to help us understand where we're heading, and more importantly, advocating for more intentional development of technology so that we're not always playing catch up and trying to fix our messes, but ideally getting ahead of them. So I guess I'll close with one project that I did this year. And that is, I've been thinking about this for a long time. And I got a grant this year to help develop a work that I've been sort of stewing on called Maelstrom Escape Strategies. And this is one of the enduring metaphors in Marshall McLuhan's work is taken from Edgar Allan Poe, who wrote a story called The Descent into the Maelstrom. Are you familiar with it? Yeah. It's a short story. It's a really interesting short story. And in the story, in the North Atlantic, there's these three brothers, they're fishermen. And where they live, there's this giant vortex of the ocean, this huge maelstrom. Everybody knows about it. You stay away from it, you're okay. But the best fishing is kind of on the other side of it, right? You can catch, a week's worth of great fish in an afternoon if you do it right. So these guys, time everything. They go and do their thing. They come back. However, inevitably, one time they time things not so great. And before they realize it, they're screwed. And they end up getting sucked into the vortex. Immediately, one guy's thrown overboard. He dies. Another brother kind of snaps, loses his mind, and he's useless. But the third brother, the narrator, it's a giant vortex, and he's going around and around. And he describes that after the initial terror wears off, he kind of catches his breath, and it's like this is taking forever. He's starting to look around him, and he realizes that certain objects, instead of descending the maelstrom, are actually going up and out. I was like, well, that's kind of interesting. And he studies them a bit more and realizes they have things in common. And he thinks that's possible if I tie myself to this trunk, and if I time it just right, I might be able to get onto the exit ramp instead of getting sucked down. His brother has lost his mind. He can't save him. Ties himself to this trunk, times it right, jumps into the void. He's carried up and out and survives. Well, my grandfather used this as an analogy about our situation and our possible survival. It's like we're caught in this giant technological maelstrom, but our disadvantage is that it's invisible. We feel that we're in it, but we have a hard time seeing it because the effects are subtle. It's not as simple as cause and effect. It's an environmental thing, and it's really hard to get to apprehend an entire environment at one time. We just know that we're not doing so hot, So I've taken this metaphor literally, and the way I see it in my work, my piece, I identify three things. First, when you're caught in a maelstrom, the first thing you need to do is survive. So we need to catch our breath. We need to figure out ways to get out of the maelstrom. Second thing we need to do is implement them. So we need to survive, then we need to escape. And if we've managed to get that far, we need to avoid jumping headfirst into the next maelstrom that comes along. We need to be smarter about it. And we can. We know that technologies affect us in ways that we don't anticipate. We know that the side effects always end up outweighing the main effects, or the things we optimize for. We also have tools through McLuhan work and other work to anticipate these effects. So we need to bring those things all together and design smarter and not create the vortex in the first place, or at least not jump headfirst into it. Now, again, because I'm about accessibility, my primary concern is things that we can all do. So the easiest way, my wife and the kids and I hopped in a car and drove to the West Coast in the summer. And 3 weeks we're on the road. I'm driving 8 to 12 hours a day. I don't have time to pick up my phone and check notifications and whatever else, right? the easiest way to make a break is to make a clean break. But it's a very privileged position to be able to just not use a smartphone. It's such a part of our lives. The internet, all these things. It's, a very privileged position to be able to say, well, just turn it off. It's not that simple. So what can we do? And so my piece, The Maelstrom Escape Strategies, is a bit of a guidebook where I identify some ways things that everybody can do to help us escape some of the effects of the maelstrom. One of them, for example, is, so this came to me while we were on our road trip, and we're driving through the mountains, and you see these signs saying, showing a grade like this in a truck, and it says trucks use lower gear, because when you shift to a lower gear, you slow the whole thing down. Well, this can work for us cognitively as well. One of the main problems that we have today is things happen so fast, everybody feels this mounting anxiety and stress, right? And a lot of that has to do with speed. Well, we can slow down our minds. And one way we can do that is, I've actually clocked it, but I can type about 80 words a minute. I can write by hand about 40. So I write letters. I do all my notes with pen and paper, because in order to, writing a letter to somebody maybe sounds simple, but try doing it. It's actually difficult. It's not physically difficult, but it's cognitively difficult, because if you can only write 40 words a minute and your mind is traveling faster than that, it's difficult to match the speed. Slowing down your hand slows down your mind, because you have to slow down your thoughts in order to make them coherent and to come out as anything that makes sense on paper. So if you take 15 minutes a day, a few days a week, to write by hand, it's going to have that cumulative effect. The same comes with reading. And this is a great place to talk about this in a library full of books. But reading on paper and reading on the screen are very different things. They're experientially different, and they have very different effects. For one thing, you read a lot faster on a screen than you do on paper. It's the nature of, part of it is the font, like sans serif fonts, like Helvetica and whatever, you can actually read faster. The serifs slow you down a little bit, those little things on the end of the letters. Same with reading it on a screen where the light is coming through versus on a piece of paper where the light is bouncing off. The nature of the media, it's a slower process to actually read things on paper. If you want to slow it down even further, read it out loud. But these have cognitive effects too. So it's a bit of a mind hack to slow down your mind and reduce your anxiety a little bit by writing on paper and reading on paper. And this is not the same thing as throwing away your smartphone. Anybody can get a book from the library and read for 15 minutes a day. Anybody can find 15 minutes a few times a week. Even a single parent with a couple of kids, you can find 15 minutes a few days a week. And it has measurable effects. I have people do this, students of mine and other people, and they report back that it actually is beneficial. So this is the kind of thing that I look for and that I try and suggest that people do, is identify little pockets, because little differences can add up to big differences, and we have to start somewhere. So that's the talk, I think. Woo!